What's up, folks? So I did a thing and I want to show you. I built, or rather rebuilt, my own arrows. Wanted to kind of talk about why I did this and how I did this. So a lot of my arrows were looking pretty ratty. Just kind of some marks on here from times when I've gone all the way through a target, or just the veins being kind of scuffed up. And so really my arrows were due for some TLC. So I wanted to take care of them and re-fletch all my own arrows. Now I was using these Beman ICS Hunter Classic carbon arrows, and I actually really like the shafts. My only complaint is they're not super durable. They're a bit more brittle than other carbon arrows out there, but they're very straight. They tend to be very accurate, and I had a bunch of these and I was pretty happy with how they performed, and they seemed to be spined just right for my bow. So I used the existing shafts and I basically sliced off all the existing fletchings. The veins that were on there were they were pretty worn out. And I know you can use a special tool to take that off. I basically just used a pocket knife, a fairly dull pocket knife, and just kind of cut them off, and then just made sure to take off all the glue and all the little bits of vinyl that were still left on there. Now in doing that, I wanted to be really careful to just basically cut stuff off the top, scrape stuff off the top, and not to be digging into the carbon. I didn't want to take off any carbon. I'm sure I probably took off a little bit just because I was scraping it and sanding it, right? But I was really trying to be careful to take off as little as possible. So after doing that, I re-fletched these, and I'll show you how I did it in a moment. But I want to talk about why I did this myself. Obviously I could buy a bunch of shafts, go to an archery shop, have them fletch them, or I could just go to an archery shop and say, hey, make me some arrows that are right for my bow, or I could just go to a big box store and buy some pre-made arrows. That's basically what I had done originally when I bought these Beman arrows. They were pre-made up, and the advantage to that is you get your insert already put in there. There's already veins on it. There's already usually a pretty decent knock put on it. But I wanted to learn how to do this myself. I think a lot of times, you can go do something a little bit more efficiently, a little faster, by spending a little bit of money and going to a pro. And a lot of times it's worth it to do that. But a lot of times, you can spend the exact same amount of money and do it yourself, but you learn something in the process. So by learning something in the process, I know more about how these veins work. I know more about how they're fletched on there. I know the requirements of the glue to hold that on there. So there's a lot of incidental learning in doing something yourself. And I think a lot of times you can spend the same amount of money either way, but if you learn something, it's worth it. So let's take a look at the details of this exact arrow and kind of how I put it together. So if you're new to archery, you may not know this. If you've been into archery for a while, you probably definitely do know this, that pretty much all archery components are sold by the dozen or by the half dozen. So in putting together my own arrows, I kind of waited a little while until I had a dozen bare shafts that really needed an update, or a dozen shafts total where most of them needed an update, just because that's how you buy components. So it made sense to wait till I could buy, all the wraps, all the veins, everything by the dozen, so that I could do a dozen arrows at once. Now you don't have to do it that way. I just think it makes sense. That way you can buy components according to what you're needing to build. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm using these Beman ICS Hunter Classic shafts. They're straightened to 3/1000ths of an inch, which is pretty good. It's better than an entry-level arrow. It's not as good as some of the really highly advanced ones, but for my purpose, it's more than enough. That arrow is more than straight enough for what I need. So in putting together these arrows, I've found that they work very well with blazer veins. And I think most modern arrows from compound bows tend to work very well with blazer veins. Blazer veins are almost used, or even abused, a little bit in how effectively they work. There's a lot of people who don't really have their rests set up properly, but the blazer vein manages to save the day. So these veins work incredibly well. So that was an important part of this setup. I wanted to make sure that I was using blazers. Another critical part of this build is I realized that I wasn't going to be using illuminated nocks. I had some nocturnals on my arrows previously, and I really like the way they look on camera. I really like the way they look for just finding them in the field. but ultimately I didn't like adding that much weight to the wrong end of the arrow. Generally you want weight on the front end of the arrow so that it arcs nice and evenly. Adding weight to the back end tends to destabilize the arrow. Now I'm sure an archery pro can explain that a little bit better, but I know you don't want to add more weight on the back. And it was just kind of a pain when I was practicing with lighted nocks, having to go find them and turn them off. And a lot of people will practice with these nocks and then for hunting season they'll go put their lighted nocks on. But I really didn't want to be changing the weight of the arrow. I'm very intentional to use field points and broadheads that are the same weight on the front end of the arrow. So why would I want to use nocks for practice and for hunting that are completely different weights? That could throw everything off. So I knew I wasn't going to be using lighted nocks, so I wanted to increase visibility. And that's why I put this white arrow wrap under the fletching. I know that this white arrow wrap will help me see the arrow in flight a little better. Just that bright white will catch the eye. It'll make it easier to find because typically this is the only thing you're going to find. When you've got a dark gray or black carbon arrow, that just always seems to, you know, blend into the dirt and become impossible to find. So really, the fletchings, the nocks, this end is where you're going to be able to see it. I also think the bright white will be helpful if I shoot an animal, finding the blood on the arrow and using that to look at the arrow and kind of analyze whether, you know, it's dark, thick blood, whether it's a lung shot, what kind of blood I see on the arrow will kind of help determine where I hit the animal. And that's really, really helpful in tracking, just to kind of help figure out what the animal's going to do when it's hit. Now I know that Beman even sells their ICS Hunter in, I think they call it the whiteout, where almost the entire shaft is a white color. I didn't really like something that bright just because if I'm wearing camo and intentionally trying to hide, having this completely bright white arrow, I don't know, it's a little bit of a detriment to that. So if I just added some white cresting down here, it helps me see it better, and it serves the purpose of, if I get a pass through on an animal, it helps me see what kind of blood is on there. Now if I don't get good penetration, if the arrow only sinks in to here on an animal, well, this isn't going to tell me much, right? But if I only get penetration to here, likely I'll see the arrow hanging out of the animal, and so it'll be a little bit more obvious to tell where the animal is hit. I went with the white cock vein on these arrows purely for visibility, something that would be really easy to see, and that way I'm less likely to mess it up. I'm less likely to put the arrow on wrong. Now I haven't had issues with that previously, but I figured keeping it as easy and as visible as possible is good. I went with red for the hen veins, just purely because a lot of the accessories on my bow are red. So, you know, keeping it all matchy-matchy is cool, right? So I use these boning arrow wraps. I purchased these off Amazon. You can get them at Cabela's or any archery shop, but I just purchased them on Amazon because I saw they were exactly what I needed and they would be here in 2 days. I used the 4-inch length. They also sell them in a 7-inch length, but I didn't really want to cover up, you know, a huge portion of the arrow. I just wanted to cover under the fletching and a little bit further. So 4-inch was right. And then I am just using a standard diameter arrow. I didn't need the small or extra small. I think that these ICS Hunters they're something like 0.300, so 300 thousandths. I'm pretty sure that's right, but they're a standard diameter arrow. They're not like one of the small injections or the Easton Axis or anything like that, and they're not like a large target arrow, so they're the right size. So I got a 12 pack just because I was doing 12 arrows at a time, but what was really cool is that in this 12 pack, it was a baker's dozen. It came with an extra, and I was really thankful for that because when I was setting these up, I screwed the first one up. And trying to take the feathers off without scratching or tearing up the wrap is next to impossible. So I ended up just cutting the whole thing off, using the extra to redo that first arrow, and it saved my bacon. It worked out really well. So very cool for these guys to actually include an extra one in their 12 pack. I don't have the card that came in the package, but in addition to using the boning arrow wraps, I used the boning blazer vanes. Like I told you earlier, these blazer vanes work incredibly well just for stabilizing the arrow flight. Now I noticed buying 12 of these wasn't really cost effective, so I just bought, I'm pretty sure this was a 36 pack, of each variety. So I obviously have a whole bunch of extra white ones, which I used for the cock vane, and I have some extra red ones that I use for the hen vane. But you can buy these in, I think, a 36 pack, or you can really buy them in bulk, buy like a 50 pack. But you buy them just like this, so they're nice and easy to work with. The jig I used to assemble this was the Easton Fletch. So I'm sure there are better jigs, more professional jigs out there. This thing's all made of plastic, so it's probably not professional grade. I wouldn't think this would be the same one an archery shop would use, but I like it because it does a pretty good job for doing, you know, a dozen arrows, a fairly small volume. It does a good job, and it's very easy to use. So this is the jig, and then it comes with this little end cap. So basically you just fold these out. You gotta open it up, and then so you open it up here. It's got almost like a keyhole pattern. So you open it up, and then I've got a little bit of glue in here so you can tell it's kind of stiff. But you open it up kind of like flower petals. It opens like that. You position the arrow down in the jig. Now you'll notice that it's got one gray arm and two orange arms. So that tells you where you're going to locate the cock vane versus the hen vanes. So you put your arrow shaft in there, and so this jig aligns up your nock appropriately, so you won't have to go back in and spin your nocks, especially if you're gluing them. Now I don't glue my nocks, I just have them in there real tight. They can still spin if they need to, but if you glue your nocks, you definitely want that lined up appropriately. After your arrow's in there, you'll take whatever vanes you want to use. You'll put the cock vane in here, and you want to push it all the way to the bottom, because these are meant to accommodate lots of different vane sizes. So if you're using larger vanes, yeah, it can fill up the whole space, but these short blazers, they obviously don't fill up the full space. And I'm just kind of doing this not really how I would do it, just to kind of show you. Now one thing about this jig that you can kind of see right here is I've got some glue in there. It's already gotten clogged up a little bit, so you probably will need to clean this with some alcohol right after you do it so that doesn't happen to you. So you just basically put them in there, you put the glue on the vanes, and then you close them up. I recommend closing them up one at a time, being very careful to line them up, because if you line it up off center, these can bend a little bit, see that? If you line it up off center, anytime you push it side to side, you're going to be kind of crinkling that surface of the vane, or at a minimum dragging glue all over the place. So you'll go ahead and close them up one at a time, and then you'll slide this end cap down over your arrow, and it's got little lines on there to index it properly, and that will lock around, hold them in place, and then you can grab the other end of this, twist it, and that'll actually apply some downward pressure just to hold everything in place. Now I don't know if this is how they recommend doing it or not, but I let that sit about 3 to 4 minutes. I didn't let it completely dry. I let it sit 3 to 4 minutes, and then I took the ring off. I unlocked this, and I could tell that it was on there pretty firmly because I kind of had to pop these off. There was a little bit of resistance, but the vanes were obviously glued on the arrow at this point. The reason I didn't let it dry completely is that way I could take a paper towel with a little bit of alcohol on it, and I could actually wipe the area in between the vanes just to wipe off any excess glue. I've seen people who have tried to glue their own, and they just have big old globs of glue on there, and that adds weight and it looks ugly, and I didn't want that. So no, I didn't do it perfectly, but just pulling it out when it's almost dry but not quite, and wiping off the glue seemed to help. So I'm going to do that in the future, and so I would recommend that. Now when I fletch my arrows, I use the arms that came pre-installed on the Easton EZ-Fletch jig. These vanes are definitely more for an arrow you would shoot from a compound bow, kind of designed for shorter vanes, but they also have a right-hand helical built into this. So if you look at that, you can tell it's not quite a straight line. There's a little bit of a twist to it. So it keeps your helical preset, so that way you can keep the same helical on everything, and it's really easy to get that helical. You don't have to do anything weird. I know a lot of people like using stuff like the NAP Quick Fletch, the little shrinky dink ones, just so that you can get that helical, but this can get the exact same or maybe even a faster helical, but I get to decide whatever vanes I want to use. I don't have to use the ones that are attached to the NAP shrinky dink thing. So I use the helical ones, but if you're doing traditional archery or recurve, or you just wanted straight fletchings for some reason, it also comes with these arms in the same kit, so you don't have to choose one version or the other. The arms can basically, there's a little pin that holds them in there, so you can replace the arms if you need to. But these are for a straight fletch arrow, and I think these are for 5-inch, maybe even up to 6-inch. But these are for longer feathers if you wanted to go that route and straight fletch your arrow. So you've got a couple options here, and I think that's good, because Easton didn't necessarily try to build a universal thing that could do any combination, but they tried to find the two most common ways you would fletch your arrow and make it really easy and pretty cheap. And to glue all this together, I actually used the Easton Quick Bond glue. It seemed to flow pretty well. You do have to cut off the tip. Let me just go ahead and open that up. You do have to cut off the tip just like super glue or anything else. But this seems to have a very strong hold. It seems to work very well. And it flowed really smoothly. I didn't really have too many issues with bubbles. I had a couple times where it bubbled up and I had to kind of even it out, but not bad. It says it's very quick drying. I never actually timed it. What I noticed is in 3 to 4 minutes in the jig, it's set up really well, and then I could still wipe away the excess. So it didn't dry completely in that time. I was still able to manipulate it after the fact, but it had set really well. So this glue was fairly cheap. I think there's lots of good glues on the market, but I would say definitely worth buying a specific archery glue rather than just using super glue or something like that. Now, in a pinch, could that work? Sure, I bet it could. But this seemed to work really well with the other components I was using. Something I actually neglected to mention earlier is that after I had used my knife to slice off the old veins on here, I really wanted to make sure that the shaft was nice and smooth and clean. So I just took a shop towel, just a coarse paper towel, and used Comet cleaner and just use that on the shaft of the arrow, because I didn't want to use a heavy sandpaper. I didn't want to use something that was going to take off a lot of material. I wanted a really mild abrasive that could just make sure that glue was either taken off or at least smoothed out. So I used just that shop towel with Comet on there to kind of polish it basically and even it out. And then I took another shop towel with just regular cleaning alcohol and used that just to wipe off any excess on there. So I think that was also important in setting these up, because you don't really want a really rough shaft. It won't stick evenly if there's still old glue or even grooves from scraping it left on there. So getting it nice and clean and even was important. Something else that I thought was helpful that you might be able to see here is when I actually glued these, I made sure to index the arrow wrap under where the cock vein was going to go. That way it'll keep the arrow wrap from peeling up. So overall, this was definitely a learning experience for me. I've been in archery for a couple of years now, and I really enjoy it. I'm not an expert. I'm not the best shooter. I think I'm effective enough, but it's definitely a fun hobby, and learning how to build your own components, I guess it's similar to people who are into precision rifle shooting, who like hand loading their own ammunition. So it helps you learn more about what you're doing and why you're doing it. So it's definitely an interesting and fun experience for me. I learned a lot, and now I've got some really nice arrows that I think look great. Maybe they're not professional quality, but they look great, they're well made, and it's time to get some practice in, because I need to get practice in before bow season, and I'm excited to shoot these new arrows. So, fun experience. Until next time, stay safe, be free, and never stop seeking adventure.